As Iran-US ties further deteriorate, the Trump administration announced its new Iran Action Group. But Iran says any U.S. attempt to overthrow the Islamic Republic would fail. So what's the U.S.'s new strategy and who will be on board? And big plans are in the pipeline for Russia and Germany. Nord Stream 2 will double the existing pipeline's capacity for delivering natural gas to Europe from Russia. But why is the U.S. saying the project is so menacing? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif says the U.S.'s new Iran Action Group designed to overthrow the Islamic Republic will fail. His comments came on Sunday, which also marked the 65th anniversary of the U.S.-backed coup that overthrew the democratically elected Iranian Prime Minister. Iran-U.S. relations have been tainted ever since. The significance of the timing was lost on no one. Comparing U.S. President Donald Trump's latest sanctions on Tehran with the 1953 coup, Zarif added that Tehran will not let history repeat itself. So why exactly did the Trump administration set up the Iran Action Group? How willing are U.S. allies to go along with Trump's with us or against us strategy? And what's Iran doing to brace for the next round of U.S. sanctions, which go into effect on November the 4th? Joining me for the discussion are Ahmad, Khalid, Majidyar, a fellow and the director of the Iran Observed Project at the Middle East Institute, and Dr. Richard Weitz, director and senior fellow at the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute, joining us both from Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Mr. Majidyar, let me go to you first. Exactly what is this Iran Action Group? Why such a name, first of all? And secondly, is it under the U.S. Department of Secretary of State Department, or is it under the White House? Exactly what is this organization or this entity?
The Iran Action Group is the latest move by the Trump administration to step up economic and diplomatic pressure on Iran. The Action Group will have two key responsibilities. First, it will be to bolster interagency coordination here in the United States. And secondly, it will also work with U.S. allies, particularly with European powers, to get their support in putting pressure on the Iranian government diplomatically and economically, so as to force the Iranian leaders to come to the negotiating table for a new and more comprehensive deal that would address not only Iran's nuclear activities, but also its controversial ballistic missile program and regional activities. But of course, from Iran's perspective, this is seen as an attempt by the administration to topple their regime.
Yeah, Dr. Weitz, explain to us in greater details how different is this Iran Action Group, or what extra resources or extra mandate or manpower this group will have different from the previous people or department responsible in handling diplomacy with Iran, that makes it like having a greater chance of success.
Right, you're right that that's an important point, that it's not really giving it a significant change from what we have now. I mean, it's more of a bureaucratic effort to try and focus U.S. attention on this issue within the State Department and perhaps other government agencies. So it's a way of ensuring that people will be working on this every day. There'll be regular meetings, that all the players and stakeholders will be involved, that diverse perspectives are considered. But it doesn't necessarily give the U.S. government new capabilities. It just means we'll use the existing capabilities hopefully more efficiently, more effectively.
So are you saying, Dr. Weitz, that this is more of a kind of a bluff than anything of substance? Should the Iranians be more worried than before?
Well, okay, they're breaking that into two. It's not really, I mean, it's not as if this is a nothing move, a gloss. It's an effort to use the existing capability somewhat more efficiently. Whenever there's a high priority objective in the U.S., they often will establish a special group within the government that would take the lead in this effort and make sure that try to make sure that all the other players are focused on this. So, you know, that's what it is. It's a structure. So I'm not sure the Iranians, I mean, the title of the program is a bit misleading. There's no U.S. effort to overthrow the Iranian government and any major shift in U.S. policy goals were laid out earlier this year. It's just more an effort to use the existing tools and effort more efficiently, effectively.
That's definitely how the Iranians are seeing it for the moment, at least, as we have seen the reaction from the Iranian Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif comparing this with the overthrow of Dr. Mossadegh in 1953. And there is also a comparison of this project with the future of Iraq project, which was kind of set up to oversee the overthrow of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. So, Mr. Majidyar, do you see these kind of comparisons overreaction, or should, you know, is it understandable that people are drawing these comparisons? By the way, the timing doesn't also help for people to dispel this kind of speculation.
Yeah, absolutely. The timing was perhaps a coincidence, but not very much well timed, because that was the anniversary of the overthrow of the democratic elected government in Iran in 1953, which U.S. and Britain had played a part in. But the Iranian leaders definitely are playing into Iranian nationalism, telling the Iranian people that the Trump administration is bent on toppling the Iranian government once again. But this increased pressure by Washington is worrying for the Iranian leaders, because it comes at a time that the regime in Tehran is facing increasing unrest because of deteriorating economic conditions, and also that people's political and other grievances because of Iran's regional activities, and also because of the corruption and mismanagement in the country as well. But I think that, coming back to the Iran Action Group, one major difficulty of this action group would not just be to deal with Iran, but it also would be to get the support of the international actors, because even European allies are not siding with Washington to reimpose the sanctions. And China, Russia, and other key international partners have also made it clear that they are not abrogating the nuclear deal, and they're trying to implement it rather than cancel it.
Exactly. Dr. Weitz, what kind of challenges, what's the likelihood of success for the Iran Action Group? And also, it is led by this person called Brian Hook, who was overseeing the U.S.'s administration's efforts to revise the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, but without avail. And now he has been traveling to some over 20 countries, trying to persuade people to abandon this deal. Why should we believe that he's going to be more successful this time?
Well, the U.S. effort actually has been more successful than some of us would have thought. So the European governments and the Chinese government and others have strong, objected to the sanctions. They're not been approved by the UN Security Council, so they're basically, the U.S. is imposing sanctions on them without their consent, is their argument. But we've seen a number of cases, most recently yesterday when Total announced it was just leaving Iran entirely, that whatever their governments say at the level of the national companies in Europe, their decision makers will just decide it's just too risky losing access to the U.S. market, falling afoul of U.S. sanctions and so on, and they will just prudently not invest in Iran, not deal with Iran, rather than risk their access to the more important U.S. economy. So we've seen a series of blows against the investment in Iran and so on. Russia and China, for the most part, their companies are sticking with the deal in theory, but I'll bet in practice even some of them will hesitate to invest.
So are you saying that actually the U.S.'s strategy on Iran, or the Trump administration's strategy on Iran, is actually working out, despite the fact that, you know, they are doing this by the unilateral way of, you know, that they have undertaken to deal with many different issues, be it DPRK, be it trade relations with China? Dr. Weitz, how are you looking at this?
Yes, I would say so far. I mean, given what the anticipated might be the cost of some of these moves beforehand, you know, you mentioned the climate deal and others, the U.S. has not suffered that great cost, at least initially. So other countries have gone along or have limited their resistance. In the case of Iran, Turkey, their economies are suffering. I mean, there is an obvious exception here, which is the case of China. There's been these series, as we know from your earlier programs, of series of mutual tariffs, and so far neither side's backed down. But in other cases, the strategy has been somewhat successful.
Okay. Mr. Majidyar, do you see any short-term or long-term ramifications of the policy of the Trump administration when it comes to Iran, now using forcefully, you know, unilateral action to pull out of this deal, whether or not its allies or, you know, other international stakeholders agree with it? That's how they do it, and they can do it at the moment because they're so powerful financially and economically. But what kind of other ramifications could this have in the long run?
Dr. Weitz is correct that major European countries and international banks also they have scaled down or they have suspended their economic and trade
Sure,
activities.
everybody's afraid of the United States because it's so powerful.
Yeah, but the key question is that while major companies are withdrawing, there are mid-level and smaller companies that, encouraged by the European Union and also other governments, to continue to do business with Iran. So in the absence of an international consensus and support, Iran might still have some economic lifeline to continue to survive without being forced to come back to the negotiating table with the Trump administration. So that is the key challenge, because the first round of sanctions, which came in place earlier this month, only bars Iran from dealing with dollars and some other sanctions. But the most significant sanctions come into effect in November, and that will target Iranian oil sector and central bank. So at that time, we will see that whether countries like India and China will significantly reduce its oil, that will have tremendous impact on Iran and might force Iran to seek some negotiated settlement with the Trump administration.
In one word, Mr. Majidyar, what's your prediction? Do you think comes November, Iran will succumb to the pressure from the United States or other countries still doing business with Iran?
I think that the Iranian government will not have any high-level summit, something like North Korea with the Trump administration, because it will be a political suicide for President Rouhani back home to do so. However, it will try to work with the European allies and also with other countries like Russia and China in order to minimize the impact of U.S. sanctions. But certainly we'll see more confrontation rather than cooperation between Tehran and Washington in the days and weeks ahead.
We're going to leave it there. Many thanks to Ahmad Khalid Majidyar, a fellow and the director of the Iran Observed Project at the Middle East Institute, and Dr. Richard Weitz, director and senior fellow at the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute, joining us from Washington, D.C. You have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. When we come back, Russia and Germany are working together to bring more natural gas to Europe from Russia, but Trump's not so happy, as well as some Eastern European countries. We'll find out why. Stay with me. Despite objections from the U.S., Russia and Germany are moving ahead with their energy deal. When Russian President Vladimir Putin sat down with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel last Saturday during his second visit to Germany this year, the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline topped the agenda. Putin says the $11 billion project will double the existing pipeline's annual capacity of 55 billion cubic meters in order to meet Europe's growing need for natural gas. However, U.S. President Donald Trump has berated EU leaders over the deal. During his recent visit to Europe, he called Germany captive to Russia and offered to sell U.S. liquefied natural gas to the EU. So why is the U.S. so agitated about the Nord Stream 2 project? Is Trump's plan viable, considering Russian gas is much cheaper and closer? Joining me from Boston is Simon Sarajian, founding director of the Russia Matters project at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. From Berlin, Dr. Josef Bramel, senior fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and from Moscow, Dr. Pavel Felgenhauer, Russian political
Hello.
and defense analyst. Welcome to all of you. Mr. Sarajian, let me go to you first. Why is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline so urgently needed and yet so controversial? Will the project make Europe, as many fear, more dependent on Russian energy?
Well, I don't think it's urgently needed, but there's definitely desire on the part of Germany and Russia to develop their energy cooperation and to have Russian gas flow, more Russian gas flow directly to Germany. It makes economic sense for both sides, but I don't see any urgency. Germany is in no dire need of more Russian gas right now. Neither is Russia in particularly poor situation economically. So, but eventually, I mean, it makes sense for both countries to develop their energy cooperation in general and gas trade in particular.
Well, maybe urgent is not the right word, but definitely Germany has stayed with the project even when other countries have shown more hesitation. Really, so Dr. Bramel, what is the consideration on the part of Germany to decide to import more gas from Russia? Some are calling Russia, you know, having a kind of a choke hand on Germany's energy supply.
Well, it's both an economic argument. Gas from Russia is a lot cheaper than LNG now offered by the United States. And even the geopolitical argument Trump used at the NATO summit against Germany is short-sighted. At the end of the day, China is on the radar screen of the United States of America, and Russia will be needed to contain China from a U.S. perspective. Trump is already preparing that, is being withheld by Bob Mueller and Congress, but at the end of the day, Russia will be needed. So there will be geopolitics, not the geopolitics of the Cold War, but the present and the future. And if you look 2 days ahead, you will see America will need Russia to contain China.
Very interesting theory there. Definitely, I don't think President Trump is that far-sighted. What he was thinking, I think, in many people's mind was to sell U.S. gas. And on the other hand, when he was visiting Europe, he was talking about, for instance, what he said to NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg. He said, Germany is captive to Russia because it is getting so much of its energy from Russia. They pay billions of dollars to Russia, and we, meaning the United States, have to defend them against Russia. So, Dr. Felgenhauer, is there any legitimacy in President Trump's claims there?
Well, that depends on, it's in the eyes of the beholder. I mean, there's many arguments and many not very right arguments about the Nord Stream gas pipeline project. In Europe, Russian friends, Russian businessmen who work with Russia and make money with Russia, and Austrian and German politicians, they often say that this is a purely economic project. In Moscow here, no one really repeats. Officially, the Russian position is, yes, we agree that's just an economic project. But here in Moscow, no one really repeats that because everyone knows it's not economic. Because this is about 10 billion euros that are just going to be spent on really producing capability to supply gas that already exists. I mean, Russia right now could ship much more gas into Europe if Europe's ready to buy it through the existing pipelines.
So exactly why?
The real sense of the Nord Stream
Yeah.
2, that's geopolitical, to bypass Ukraine. To bypass Ukraine from the south, to bypass Ukraine from the north, so that Russia could fully supply its share of the cover its share of the European market in natural gas, while totally stopping the movement of gas through Ukraine. That's very important for Russia. And no one in Moscow is actually pretending that it's different.
Okay, what he said, what Mr. Putin said during a press conference with Merkel is quite different. However, let's hear from Mr. Sarah John's opinion here. Do you agree with what Dr. Fagenhauer just talked about, that Russia is building this pipeline, the second pipeline, purely to bypass Ukraine, which considers itself a gateway of Russian gas to Europe?
Well, there's no such thing as a monocausality. So actors here are not driven by one particular interest or factor. If you look from the economic perspective, Russia has to pay Ukraine $3 billion a year for transit. So this pipeline is going to cost $10 billion. So eventually, in 4 years, it will pay off if Russia were to completely cut supplies through Ukraine, which is not going to happen because about more than 90 billion cubic meters go through Ukraine, and this additional pipeline is going to, Nord Stream 2 is going to be around 55 billion cubic meters capacity. So it makes sense, as I said, economically, for Russia to sell directly by passing the intermediary, if you will, and for Germany to buy.
Right.
But of course, Russia also has a vital interest in anchoring post-Soviet neighborhoods to itself. So in that sense, yes, ability to decrease transit through Ukraine provides additional leverage for Russia in its efforts to keep Ukraine from joining NATO and EU, if you will. Therefore, it's neither purely economic nor purely geopolitical project. It's both.
Russia has previously cut off gas to Ukraine and Eastern Europe during freezing midwinter in the course of disputes. So, Dr. Bramall, are German consumers, is the German government convinced that this is not going to happen in the future when the Nord Stream 2 is completed?
Well, Germany is also thinking in terms of renewables. We will also see one day peak demand. We will have changing habits, and actually there is too much gas as we speak. But that's the economic argument. I'm returning to the geopolitical argument. Russia depends on income by its sales. Should the price or the quantity drop, Russia will be in dire straits. Though the sanctions don't do the trick. That actually helped Putin to fortify his base, but income from energy may hurt it. And the West should really think about what is more dangerous, an energy-potent Russia or a failing state Russia. And Russia's economy depends heavily on the sale of oil and gas, and so does the political regime. And nobody has an interest in regime failure of Russia.
Dr. Fagenhauer, what do you say to that? And also, U.S. President Donald Trump was talking about, selling U.S. LNG to Europe. Is U.S. LNG appealing to Europe customers at this moment or in the near future?
Well, of course, in Moscow, that's interpreted that the entire American opposition to Nord Stream 2 is just because America wants the lucrative European gas market for itself and wants to push Russia out, decrease Russian share of that market. And this is a lucrative market, and it is very important for Russia economically, and it's important politically, too. So that's seen as unjust kind of competition from the American side. And also Russia, together with Germany, resisting American sanctions, is also seen not just simply keeping this project, very important project for Russia, alive. It's also seen as a way to maybe loosen up transatlantic ties between Berlin and Washington. And this is a very long-term and long-time Russian strategy to build a kind of, partially at least, the better, push America out of Europe and form access and alliance with Germany and other West European countries, kind of marry German technology with Russian resources and military might, that this is a natural alliance. And if we have Germany on our side, well, France will maybe come there too, and then other maybe Western European countries will join in. And that's the kind of Europe that Russia wants to see in the future.
Well, last month, Trump and European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker talked about eliminating tariffs and other trade barriers. The Trump administration agreed to put any new tariffs on hold, while the EU pledged to increase imports of American soybeans and LNG. Mr. Sarajan, do you think this deal actually stands the fact test, and whether the EU have any power to force their companies and countries to buy LNG from the US when they have cheaper alternatives from Russia?
Well, I'm not an expert on European politics. You know, it's really difficult sometimes to read Trump and predict what his administration is going to do next. I would say if I had to bet, I would bet against it. The Russian gas costs about a quarter less than American LNG in Europe. So Europe's is not a socialist planned economy. Therefore, and you know, Volkswagen doesn't make cars and buy gas. So, you know, you'd have to force certain companies to accept losses for others to make greater profit. And I just don't see how it can work in a market economy.
Okay.
So in the case of Germany especially, I don't think this kind of trade-off is going to work. But again, you'd have to ask my colleague in Germany.
Thank you very much. We have to leave it there. Simon Sarajan and Dr. Josef Bramel joining us from Berlin, and Dr. Pavel Felgenhauer joining us from Moscow. And that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Shane. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.